Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're excited to have you join us today for an in-depth discussion regarding the strategies for advancing the digital maturity of your supply chain execution processes. We have an exciting discussion for you today, and I think you're going to enjoy the speakers we have lined up for you. And as you know, unfortunately, this is a very timely subject due to the supply chain disruptions that we see happening around us becoming increasingly frequent, with supply chain execution taking the brunt of that, heavily impacting order management, warehousing, and transportation for such things as tariff regimes that are ever evolving, extreme weather events, and also not to mention geopolitical conflicts. That's why advancing the maturity of your digital supply chain execution ecosystem and moving away from traditional methodologies is more important than ever. Now I want to introduce to you the speakers we have lined up for today. My name is Lawrenz. I'm the Senior Director of Analyst Relations here for Infios, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Joining us from IDC is Travis Eide, who is a Research Director for IDC's Manufacturing Insights, where he currently leads the Worldwide Supply Chain Execution Strategies practice. Now, prior to joining IDC, he spent 22 years managing global logistics operations for 3PL, owner asset operator, as well as in manufacturing environments. And then joining us from Infios is Richard Stewart, who's our Executive Vice President of Industry Strategy and Product, where he is driving the next generation of supply chain execution modernization across order management, warehouse management, and transportation management. So before we dive into the content here, as far as getting into the 5-stage maturity model, let's first of all take a step back and set the stage. And maybe, Travis, you could kick us off for today's discussion around what do you see driving the push towards digital maturity?
Yeah, you bet, Rod. Thanks for that great introduction, and looking forward to the conversation here with you and Richard. And I hope people find this helpful. At IDC, we follow this very closely, and we're seeing a few macro trends that are really forcing change in this space. The first one we see, and this will come as no surprise for anybody, but it's really that push for efficiencies. The idea that in supply chain execution, organizations are really focused on both reducing and controlling costs. We see that consistently as the top priority. That hasn't really changed, and given where the current economic environment, that's only gaining more focus. But on top of that, I think the last 5 years, we've seen unprecedented disruption and a lot of things that have challenged organizations' ability to execute, to plan. And so there's really been this, enhanced focus on resilience, generating resilience to disruption. And that really kind of starts with, more capably identifying risks and coming up with mitigation strategies, kind of contingency planning amongst your supply chain execution teams. And that has to really bridge silos across these different elements of supply chain execution. So, we're also seeing the move towards, more analytics, and there's a lot of analytics, really a high focus on artificial intelligence is, everybody wants to talk about that today. So I'll be the first one to say it here in the webinar. But surely everybody sees the potential there, and deploying these kind of analytical tools to become predictive where possible, but more than likely, you're utilizing them to be quick to react, and for something that is simply going to be unforeseen, which we all see in our day-to-day business. Another element is augmenting the productivity of your staff. Organizations are really looking at taking people out of that firefighting mode and allowing them to think more strategically about their roles and bringing more value and enhancing collaboration with their stakeholders. And then there's just a couple others that we see also, is increasing the safety and security of your supply chain. We want to make sure that we're not putting anybody at risk as we work through this and deliver for customers. And then, kind of with this increased exposure to data across the ecosystem is making sure that you're not opening the door to nefarious actors to get access to your goods. And then maybe the last one I'll touch on is sustainability. That may be getting a little bit less lip service at the higher levels of organizations, but we still see that as a top 3-year priority when we ask organizations about that. They're still really focused on developing the capabilities to measure and report against sustainability metrics. And that's to better service their customers and help augment their brand identity as they deliver these supply chain execution services. And that's where we kind of come to the conversation today, is around, digital maturity and how our legacy systems inhibiting the ability to be resilient and to help control costs. And really what we're seeing is that organizations still are challenged to be able to assess and manage risk in what's becoming an increasingly dynamic and really a fast changing environment. We do an annual survey at IDC where we kind of poll supply chain stakeholders across different regions, across different industries. And when we ask them what are the top gaps that they see, immediate on a 12-month horizon or even a little bit further out on a 3-year horizon, the top response in both of those categories is the lack of sufficient collaboration. It's the idea that you need to work with your stakeholders, kind of start, seeing things the same way and start pulling in the same direction. And that really begins with visibility, which is the second thing we see is that's lacking, is that holistic visibility across their supply chain, so they can tell that common story, so they can set those common objectives and then work together to accomplish them. And then maybe the last thing I would touch on is, they're also lacking robust data analytics and insight intelligence. So they're seeing that they've gathered all this data and they understand that there's value hidden in that. They don't necessarily have the tools today to begin to uncover those and to do it in a timely and impactful way where they can drive value to their business immediately. So when we ask them, how are they, or what's preventing you from responding more capably and more quickly to market changes and disruptions, one of the things that really jumped out at us, and this was a top 3 responses, that their IT systems are dominated by legacy and on-premise applications, and that when you're operating from that standpoint, those systems are not flexible and they can't help scale to accommodate growth and help organizations achieve their growth and profitability initiatives and targets. So that's a huge challenge. As disruption kind of occurs, being able to become agile in that environment, be able to secure the capacity, be able to secure equipment, becomes increasingly challenging. But the more quickly you're able to do that, the more it becomes a competitive advantage. You're ahead of the curve. You're not chasing the market. You're kind of leading it, and you'll find that translates into better serviceability, and it also is going to translate into better better price point. And then lastly is we kind of go into this AI world and look at unleashing the power that exists in data. I think organizations are concerned about cybersecurity. They understand they need to share data. They want to be able to do that and work with their partners, but they kind of see that as opening the door to potentially nefarious actors getting access and compromising their organization. So that is not something, it's something that's become top of mind really as this push for AIs come on the scene. But we see that as as a really big benefit that organizations report back when they migrate to a cloud environment, is letting those cloud providers manage the security aspects, because they do that more capably than you can as an organization individually. So taking those dollars from maintaining systems internally and shifting those towards creating innovation for your supply chain that you can deliver on a daily, monthly, and quarterly basis. So yeah, it's really, kind of emphasizing the need for systems that are going to allow supply chain execution teams to evolve with the pace of change, as that increases in speed and the magnitude of the impact it's having. So really through, scalability and innovation, that's going to allow them to create an environment where they're making, or they're decisioning on a more holistic level in collaboration with their partners.
No, that's great insights. And thank you for sharing that, Travis. So Richard, over to you. How are you seeing that from the Infios perspective as we look at the market from our perspective and interacting with our own customers?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Rod. And yeah, great setup there, Travis. I would say from what I'm seeing from our customers in the market and the interactions that we're having, it echoes a lot of what Travis was getting across there. I mean, the truth is disruption in the supply chain is just the norm now. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, what scale of business you're in, you just simply can't escape it anymore. And supply chain execution, where we play, is really kind of that front line of defense. We are the systems that help the customers react. So when you look at the examples that we've had this year, probably the top of mind one is around tariffs and the disruption that caused, right? And I saw a stat, Travis, I think it was 81% of organizations are now rethinking their nearshore and their offshore strategy. And you think about companies like Apple and other ones, like they've spent decades building and orchestrating these strategies, and now overnight they're having to shift them. And so start of the year, we were getting phone calls that, how do I get everything on the water today before the tariffs take effect? And then that was closely followed by, how can I ship things to other countries like Canada or somewhere closer to market so that as the dust settles, or if there's a window there, I can take advantage of it. And it was just overnight, like it shifted. And we have a customs clearance solution within our transportation portfolio. They were instantly the most popular team in the entire company. And it was because companies had gone from, kind of a manual, tedious process to do a lot of the tariffs and customs clearance to now suddenly they couldn't even keep up. And so they were really looking to software to help them. Then you shift to, the other common topic in that supply chain world is around, we're seeing a lot of labor engagement. Like, I don't have enough labor. How do I retain my labor? And you see a lot of productivity pressure. So, it used to be just, how do I make people faster and more productive? And you do see that still today, but now it's becoming more of a conversation of, how do I reduce my dependency on that labor? And so you introduce automation, you introduce voice, you introduce different technologies, but then it introduces yet another problem. And that is, most of those are going to take a little bit different skill level of a worker to be able to administer and to manage that technology. And so you have that shift over now to not just, how do I make people faster, but how do I engage my employees differently? How do I retain them? I mean, frankly, how do we make supply chain fun? And so there's been a lot of disruption, and Travis, that cybersecurity note, I think is key, because every year I get those panicky, late night or early morning phone calls from customers, organizations, and a lot of them I would consider very strong in the IT ranks, but those companies that are still running a lot of the on-premise legacy solutions, they're becoming victims of some of these attacks. And that's probably the biggest push we're seeing towards cloud and SaaS solutions. But the good news is it's not necessarily, you get that initial push, but I would agree, you're starting to see the benefits, because it's freeing up what is probably, IT was some of the most critical and overburdened resources in organization. If you're freeing them up from some of those administrative and mundane tasks, they actually get to focus on the fun stuff. They're focusing on innovation, on what's ahead, what's on the horizon. So it's been really interesting and really refreshing to watch companies use that to start to focus on the future. And then, Travis, your comment on data, I think, is really, really important. And I'll be the second one to say artificial intelligence on the call today. But it's been interesting to watch where the shift has gone from, how do I collect my data? And data is everything. And then people have a big giant, storage or pile of data, but that really hasn't moved the needle, right? And so we've started in visibility, but I think companies are now starting to realize, at least the ones on the front lines, is that data is just raw material. It is a raw material, not just to help drive visibility, but also, if you bring AI into the fold, it's the raw material to help you make better decisions, to be able to help stay ahead of the competition. So it's been, Rod, just a lot of conversations as folks are just looking at all this disruption and trying to react to that, but at the same time, planning on how they stay ahead of the competition.
No, that's great, Richard and Travis both. And thank you for that insight. As far as setting up, now you've done a great job unpacking, what's leading the push to digital maturity in the market. Now I think this is a good time to position, and really, Travis, maybe you could open up and really starting to unpack what is the IDC 5-stage digital maturity model for supply chain execution. So Travis, why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, you bet. This is where we kind of see the rubber meeting the road here in this conversation is, assessing where you are and understanding where you want to be, and then, pragmatically understanding what steps it takes to get there. So we put together this model, which is, aimed at helping organizations kind of do that 3-step process. But it begins at one, which is ad hoc. We really see, it's it's a really fragmented industry, and when you have a lot of smaller players, I think that's probably what's leading a lot of resistance to technology adoption. So it's more resistant. You have really manual, disconnected processes. You're really probably exclusively reliant on spreadsheets. I think they're probably going to be communicated by exchanging emails. You have a lot of phone calls. You probably even see a fax machine mixed in there. A little bit here and there. So, but really, it's this idea of data is decentralized, and that leads to incomplete and inaccurate and inconsistent results. You're not able to capably assess risk holistically across your supply chain, and you're not understanding the trade-offs that exist as you're making decisions between you and your partners and operating on a daily and weekly basis. The second stage of that maturity is moving into an opportunistic realm where you're becoming more reactive to disruptions. You're able to begin assessing them more accurately because you have standardized some of the processes that exist behind there. You defined how to react to them, and what your overarching goals are as your team looks forward to kind of building comprehensive intelligence but with that data, although they're not really there yet. They haven't brought it together because all that data still remains siloed. And like we mentioned earlier, that's really limiting collaboration across the end-to-end supply chain execution space. The third that we see is where we see a lot of organizations is where they're repeatable. They've really standardized a lot of their processes. Automation starting to exist across different elements, but that integrated system may be allowing them to become more proactive, but that connected network has not fully been built out. They still have some black boxes that exist, both across visibility and from collaboration and communication that delays decisioning, and also leaves teams making that without fully informed information to make capable, consistent decisions. So the fourth one we have is moving into managed, and this is where we really see some of these tools that we're talking about, which is cloud migration, advanced analytics, and a collaborative environment where real-time visibility exists, and teams are allowed to see the operational world through the same lens. They see it in the same time. And they're allowed to move more into a managed by exception, so they're not bogged down by a lot of these repetitive tasks, and it becomes more fully integrated, across their end-to-end supply chain. And then the last stage that we see is optimized, and this is really, the most aspirational stage where we see a very few organizations existing. But when we talk about the tools that exist, this is kind of the Shangri-La, if you will, or the end of bringing all of this together, where you do have full visibility across your end-to-end supply chain. You've deployed and automated a lot of the decision intelligence pipeline to bring that intelligence to your team, and you're doing that comprehensively across your entire ecosystem. So everybody's seeing the same thing. All your partners are pulling in the same direction, and they're understanding and talking about those trade-offs. Understanding that when you pull a lever over here, here's the impact over here. We're not just burying somebody under that, but rather we're working through that together. And then what a big challenge is getting to that point is kind of what we're looking at right now. We'd ask in a supply chain, supply chain as a service, a survey, for logistics executions teams, how much of your operational process is still being managed by through spreadsheets. And we broke it down by inventory, logistics, and order management. But really, 74% of inventory and warehouse teams are managing mostly or completely with spreadsheets. And then 63% of logistics and transportation folks are doing the same thing. And that's really, I think, where a lot of the quick progress can be accomplished is moving out of that, eliminating some of that siloed decision making that's occurring, where you don't understand those trade-offs, and trying to eliminate some of that organizational friction that goes back and forth when organizations are performing their own, or different functions rather, are performing their own analysis and moving on that. It's not that they're making bad decisions. They're just not doing that across their stakeholders. So everybody understands and sees everything the same way. And really, like I said, I kind of beating a dead horse, but pulling in the same direction and understanding why we're going the way we are.
No, that's great. And that's great insight. So I'm curious. So Richard, perhaps you could expand upon how you see and where you see Infios customers within the digital maturity model that Travis has outlined here.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Rod. I mean, if you think through our base, we really run the full spectrum. We've got everything from that, small to medium-sized business that's maybe just starting to outgrow some of their ERP capabilities when it comes to supply chain. And, we have the other end of the spectrum where I've got, enterprise customers that are going through full digital transformation. But kind of regardless of where they are and who they are, I would say that you tend to see quite a bit of them joining us in that maybe stage 2 or early stage 3 process. And I mean, I always look at, I love the maturity model that you guys put together here. So I look at 3 as kind of the safe zone. Like you come up through your 1 and your 2 and, everything's a little bit hair on fire. But as you get into 3, that becomes a little bit of steady state. Like not everything is, an escalation. I'm starting to be predictable. But companies do have a tendency to get stuck there, at least from what I've seen, is that they get comfortable. And the next step, getting into that 4 and 5, you really have to start pushing the envelope a little bit. And a lot of times they can get blocked. And the number one blocker is the silos that get created. And sometimes those silos are departmental and, just organizational in nature. As your transportation team, talking to your distribution team, talking to your commercial team. But then oftentimes those silos do have a systematic influence as well, because if you end up with solutions that don't talk to each other, you start to have a human in the middle. You start to have a manual process in the middle. And so, you look at some examples, the, classic inventory example, I have stock out in one of my distribution centers for an item. It just so happens I have that exact same item in 4 other stores and 3 other DCs across the country, and maybe all of them could get it to my customer in time. But if you don't have a connected system, that stock out hits the stop button as soon as that first DC notices it's out of stock. And now somebody's got to alert customer service, somebody's got to try to reroute the order in time, and ultimately it's not going to happen fast enough to still get it there. Flip side of that, if you look at the transportation world, you've got, loads moving all the time. There's traffic, there's weather. Like at the moment that I know that a given load is going to be running late, my transportation solution may be able to say, hey, I now have a late load, and it can put the dot on the map on where that, truck is. It can let me know that it's going to be 3 hours late. But then again, we hit the roadblock. If I don't have that connected to my other systems, it's not going to replan the labor. It's not going to look at what orders might not get to the customers there in time. So that's ultimately what we've seen, is you kind of get stuck in that 3 unless you start to look at your systems and the need for them to start talking to each other.
No, that's great. And so Travis, I'm just kind of curious, based on what Richard has said, does that align with what you're seeing across organizations that you interact with and as part of your research into the market as well?
Yeah, I think Richard's right on. And I think there's several reasons why that's the case. Like we mentioned, that the transportation logistics industry is highly fragmented. You have a lot of stakeholders you're trying to bring together, and getting that technology across that ecosystem can be challenging. But that is the goal. Data sharing remains a challenge, and like we mentioned earlier, there's the cybersecurity concerns. But there are avenues you can take to mitigate that and, in fact, improve upon that. And that's kind of what we're advocating here. So what we really see is that desire to progress exists, but organizations commonly lack, an understanding what this is going to mean for their business. How do they begin to dig into that data to extract some of the value that they know is in there? And then, pragmatically and realistically, how do you get started? What does that look like? So it's about, when you get stuck in that 3, kind of that complacency and maintaining the status quo, and then you trying to encourage your team to establish the mindset of let's really develop and cultivate a competitive advantage out of this. Let's push the envelope of what's possible for our organization, and really make supply chain execution a value-added area of your organization.
And those are all great points you both have raised. And, next, I just want to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about how do we transition the insights and put them into action? So really, how would a company utilize these insights to build an intelligent execution strategy, and really about understanding where they are now and then how they advance from one stage into the next. So Travis, maybe you could start us off with that discussion.
You bet, Rod. And that's where we see organizations kind of getting hung up. What does this mean to them? So what we really say is that you have to start really to take a realistic assessment of what your current state is. And that's not to try to show that you're better or worse than you are, but it's about to be real, to understand where you are. Because from there, it's pretty straightforward to say, what is our desired future state? What would we like to be? Do we want to be a 5? Yeah, I think everybody does. But iteratively, what is that next step that we're going to take that allows us to move along this spectrum? Because you can't jump from a 2 to a 5. And it takes a lot of work, in fact, to go from a 3 to a 4. So what does that look like? And, starting that conversation with a collaborative mindset, bringing your supply chain partners along for that journey from the beginning helps to establish those goals transparently, communicate some of the challenges that exist, and allows your teams to work together to overcome them. And then one other thing we say is, don't let the idea of perfection stand in the way of simply getting better. It is, an iterative process. So allow your teams to take those steps and move along that, that journey towards improvement. But keep in mind what that end goal is, right? You've established that from the beginning, understand where you want to go, and just make sure that those steps are part of that bigger puzzle as you move through. And we've really identified it as several different elements, kind of in this order, but is that moving to the cloud, unlocking and breaking down some of those barriers so you can gain that holistic visibility across your ecosystem that allows everybody to start seeing things the same way. It's kind of about establishing that single source of truth, and eliminating, from there you eliminate people opposing priorities. And once you have it there, that, looking pragmatically on what analytics and AI and ML can bring to the table. What are the use cases that can deliver value, not just deploying technology for technology's sakes? And because analytics can give you a lot of great insights, but if it's not delivering value for your organization and your supply chain, what is the good in that? So you have to be really careful about that. But when you're doing that, it really solidifies that idea of an ecosystem, and then also augments your practitioners by automating, like Richard said, some of these tasks and bringing them out of that firefighting realm and allowing them to focus on more value-added tasks. Cutting down on workforce attrition and attracting that next generation of workforce to this space, which is a really big challenge for organizations. So, but as you begin that journey, we can't stress enough the importance of data governance and management protocols, and real-time integration and orchestration. The idea that bad data, if you're deploying AI tools with bad data, you're only going to reach bad decisions more quickly. So, in best case, they're just not helpful, but in most cases, they can actually be very detrimental and very costly for your organization. So you want to make sure you have a good foundation in that data. And then making sure, it's kind of the idea that we talk about the human in the loop. I think everybody's talked about that when you start to deploy AI and ML technologies. You have a breadth of experience that's available on your team. People that are intimately familiar with all the inner workings of your supply chain. And it's not to override that. It's more augmentative to allow them to deliver intelligence to them that they can decipher and understand whether it's effective to deploy that and to move on those decisions, and then slowly build that trust as you begin to integrate these tools more broadly across your execution space. And then lastly is maybe to transparently measure and report progress. Openly, have a regular cadence with the teams to openly discuss what's working, what's not. And the idea is not that you're going to get this perfect right out of the gates. That's just not how it is. You're going to have some setbacks, but you want to use those as learning experiences to bring your team together and say that we had the right intent. It might not have delivered on that, but how can we, alter that or make that better for the next time? And then when you have those setbacks, I think it's really good as an organization if you as a team have secured some executive support or support from someone in your executive team, because you are investing, you're sinking money into your supply chain, and you want to be able to communicate to your organization at the highest levels. Here's what's going on. Here's the delivery we've valued, or the value we've delivered rather. Here are the things we've learned. And even here's some setbacks, but we're turning those into positive stories, and that can help your these types of initiatives really gain legs and sustain momentum as you move forward.
Bill, thank you for that insight there. So, switching over to you, Richard. From the Infios perspective, you work a lot with our customers and potential customers and view of the market. How do you see, from the Infios perspective, where you see a lot of companies starting? What are the next steps, and what role Infios helps them play in that process?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Travis, what you mentioned, and the one I love the most was don't do technology for technology's sake. It just so happens that I'm a technologist, so I kind of go against myself when I say this, but the most successful customers we have and the organizations that are starting or going on this journey is, number one, focus on the outcome. Take the time and say, what do you want to get out of this as a business? Focus on that, the result, how you measure it, not the technology itself. And so you see a lot of companies where they're undergoing big digital transformations, and they kind of set themselves up for failure because they're going to do it all, and they're not going to see any material benefit that they can measure until the finish line. And sometimes that finish line is multiple years out there. So you really need to focus in on what do I want out of this, and then take the time to actually do incremental steps to get you there, and make sure that those incremental steps can actually be measured so that you can start to build that momentum. You can start to get those wins, build the credibility within the organization. And there's that age-old analogy I love, and that's don't let perfection be the enemy. Like, embrace failing fast. Embrace sometimes it's going to be better, but maybe it's not the best as you go along that journey. And so that's why a lot of what we're doing at Infios is really focusing on how do you take these solutions and simplify them into bite-sized modules. Example, Rod and Travis, like if you think through like an order management project is a big project, it can be intimidating. There's a lot going on. And so you always want to look at it and say, well, does a company really need a full-blown OMS? Or really what they need is, do they need an inventory module, a module that just brings together all the disparate inventory areas they have within their supply chain, balances that against demand, and so that I can accurately just be able to tell my customer, I do or do not have 2 of these that I can promise to you. Like, that's a bite-sized chunk that you could then measure, and you can measure that by like, how many back orders am I eliminating? How many out of stocks do I have? If you flip over to the WMS side, right? Like a lot of companies, they want productivity. Like, who doesn't? But do you really need a full-blown WMS? Or can you increase your throughput and your productivity by introducing technologies like maybe you're going to look at robotics, some automation, or even voice, very simple, don't change a lot of the process. And again, you can not just be more successful, but then you can show gains and you can get that credibility to the organization so that when you ask them to go on that longer journey with you, they're going to say yes. They're going to help you celebrate that journey, and ultimately you're going to be much, much more successful.
Yeah, great. So now let's transition into talking about, you both have grounded this into like the real world outcomes, but now let's talk about, what impacts are unlocked that you both see as people start advancing through that maturity curve that you guys have unpacked there. So Travis, let's start with you. What do you see as the real world impacts that people unlock when they advance in their digital maturity?
Yeah. I don't know why we'd be doing this. We weren't going to talk about that. That's at the end of the day, that's the value you're bringing to your business. So it's a good next step. And this is something we ask organizations as part of the surveys when we reach out to these stakeholders in supply chain and ask them now you've taken these steps, what are you seeing? And over the top responses are improved productivity and then a focus on cost by reducing and eliminate waste, right? Or reducing costs and eliminate waste. So those are really important, and that's what we really see is that increased agility. Organizations are able to see more timely into their supply chain. They're able to sidestep and mitigate disruption. They're enabling growth and profitability by identifying opportunities that would have been otherwise overlooked, and doing that collaboratively with teams instead of eliminating that idea of working against each other and start working together. And then really augmenting productivity. I mentioned that, but really it's the assets that you're moving, looking at how you optimize your network, making them more agile in that environment to real world circumstances that are changing. So being dynamically planning and responsive to those elements, and then augmenting the productivity of your workforce. We asked, across the supply chain execution space, where are organizations facing the most acute shortage of workforce? And overwhelmingly, it's schedulers and planners. And that's because they're always responding in these things. When systems aren't talking and recalibrating, maybe a truck's delayed in weather, can you automate that into the warehouse receiving schedule and free them from making phone calls, tracking down the trucker? Those types of things really, repetitively bog people down. But when you automate that can deliver a lot of value. When you start to do these things, what you find is that you're placing inventory closer to your customer's demand. You're doing that, eliminating the need for expedites to satisfy something because you've been proactive in the approach of getting it closer to your customer. And that makes the supply chain more customer centric, which we're all trying to do, and customers' demands are increasing, year after year and day after day. So that's extremely important. And then sustainability, I mentioned that earlier, but that's still a top priority on a 3-year horizon as kind of some of these metrics and measuring standards start to become cemented in the way organizations do business. It ties really closely into the idea of visibility as well as efficiency. Doing things more efficiently, delivering the same services with fewer resources. That translates into more sustainable operations that can really help to augment your brand and help secure and solidify some partnerships that, where that's becoming something that's, an entry-level conversation, just, condition of beginning to start doing business together. And with all this decision intelligence, what are the specific things that it can help reduce? We looked at warehousing, transportation, and then also global trade. That's a huge thing, that's been disrupted. Traditionally a very stable environment, but we're seeing an unprecedented level of people shifting. Richard mentioned earlier is nearshoring and reshoring. What does that look like? How do you do that when these supply chains have been built up over decades? But organizations are having to become more responsive and move more quickly in the face of these changes. So we really see that it's allowing organizations to reduce business process times by automating and delivering intelligence to their teams to make decisions more quickly, more consistently, and more accurately, freeing up those resources to move from daily operational and tactical tasks towards more strategic and long-term value-driven initiatives. And then, like we mentioned, becoming more agile by improving their time to action, reducing the time it takes to move and respond to things that were unforeseen, and allowing to do them effectively to help, with in the back of their mind, keep controlling costs as an overriding priority.
No, that's great. And thank you for unpacking that. So Richard, over to you. Based upon what Travis has outlined here, how are you seeing customers using Infios solutions to move up the maturity curve for themselves?
Yeah, no, Rod, I don't have time. The customer stories are my absolute favorite, so I could probably go on for a couple hours here, but I'll limit myself to a couple of ones and kind of focus in two categories. One, as we talked about, like companies that are just starting to jump from that 2 into that 3 level is like, okay, I'm just replacing kind of a legacy solution, or I'm replacing the most common ERP in the world, the spreadsheet, with something that's actually a solution. So, one example of, I've got a customer that was in apparel distribution, and they were working with a legacy solution when it comes to order management, where they had to kind of gobble up all of the inventory that was out there, all the demand, run that through all the feed. And what that resulted in was typically, once they had an order, it was at least 8 hours before they could release that to actually start that fulfillment process. And that's, 5-10 years ago, that wasn't uncommon. We were able to help the customer replace their legacy solution, introduce something that had more modern capability in terms of integration. They took that 8-hour average down to an 8-minute window. They were able to take a month-long project to set up a new market like a TikTok down to being measured in weeks and then days. And so that was a good example, I thought, of just a simple, I'm just going to replace this section of it, but I get very measurable benefits. And then on the opposite end, as you think me through the 4s and the 5s, we have a customer, they're athletic equipment manufacturing distributor, and they have gone on the journey with Infios, starting by connecting a WM and an OM module. So bringing inventory and fulfillment along with order management, and benefit for them, not just fulfillment time like we talked about in the other example, but the big thing for them was that they cut their back orders by 70%. And so you think about the benefit if I bring inventory and I connect it directly to the commercial side of my business in real time, I can now confidently start to say, I have 2 of these, I don't have 2 of these, I can ship it to you by this particular date. And so not only did they cut their back orders, but if you think, Travis, to your point earlier, the number of phone calls that somebody has to take to track down where an order is, that you take those phone calls away and you free the resource up again. And that customer is actually taking that next step with us and starting to connect their transportation solution as well. And so now they'll have the benefit I was mentioning earlier. If something's inbound is going to be running late due to traffic or weather, not just as a transportation system, I can alert the receiving team at the warehouse so they can redistribute that labor. And then even going as far as we have capability now to that receiver on the dock, as they crack open the back of the truck, if they see damage, we can let them with the WM take a picture, start a claim. Whereas in the old kind of physical process, there was a clipboard. There was a paper that sometimes did or didn't get filled out, and then sometimes did or didn't get forgotten. And so that not only helps cut the time, but it also makes sure you're not leaking potential revenue within your operation. So a couple examples there, but it's been a really fun journey as we've been going with these customers as they start to see the benefits of, again, getting out of that comfort zone in that 3 and starting to look at what happens when you start to connect solutions.
No, those are great tangible examples to leave the audience here to show tangible ways that we've been helping companies move up that maturity curve that demonstrate the 5-stage maturity model that Travis has unpacked here. As we're kind of coming to wrap up here, I don't see any questions from the audience here. So what I would like to do is just go ahead and move to the final takeaways for each of you. So maybe Travis, just spend maybe a minute or so, just maybe sharing your final thoughts. Then Richard, will pivot over to you to share final closing thoughts you may have.
Yeah, you bet.
It's for yourself.
You bet. It's kind of that idea of, enabling these systems and digital maturity to move beyond, basic automation. Focus on, understand what's going to be important for your organization. I think that's, what we see is that's focusing on increasing resilience, generating efficiencies, and improving the productivity, both of the assets that you're moving around the world and also the people that are helping to coordinate those moves. And we really see that enabled by real-time holistic visibility, kind of as that foundation of establishing and creating that base layer from which you can start to unlock some of the value that's hidden in there. You're driving for more accurate and consistent decisioning. That's going to allow your team to capture opportunities that they might not otherwise see and do that more quickly than the competition. Because when you're slow to move, you miss out on those chances in this very fast and dynamic space. So your ability to mitigate risks is extremely important. And then, that timeliness to action, that becomes a really distinct competitive advantage for organizations. So we really, encourage assessing your current maturity and working to define what those next steps look like for you pragmatically. Include your partners and your supply chain stakeholders in that conversation. Include them from the beginning so you can work together and really establish goals transparently and collaboratively to build and strengthen those relationships that can sustain over time. And we see that as that cloud analytics, action, and collaboration journey. Those are kind of the key focus areas that allow teams to accomplish this and move along this maturity curve that we've been discussing. So focus on high quality, low latency data as the backbone for your digital intelligence, and understand, like Richard mentioned, it's an iterative process. Don't let perfection be the opposite of progress. So understand that you're taking steps towards your end goal. So you can think big, but always understand that you should start small.
No, that's great. So Richard, over to you. Any closing final thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, I'd echo a lot of what we talked about today, and then also what Travis just said. And that is, the number one thing is just don't wait. Get started today, but don't let that journey intimidate you. Start small, to Travis's point. Identify some incremental wins, because number one is make sure you're building momentum and that you're gaining the credibility within the organization so that they'll celebrate with you and continue to invest. But at the same time, I would say take some time, step back, understand what that long-term goal looks like, so that as you're going through your journey, you're making smart decisions to avoid getting stuck along the way. Make sure that you're focused in on solutions that do embrace connectivity, that are going to talk to each other. And then ultimately also, don't be afraid to ask for help. Companies like Infios, we are here. We can help do assessments. We can dive in, talk about different areas that you can focus on, and also network, talk to your colleagues. Like I said, disruption is the new norm. There's a lot of folks that are going through some of the same problems that you're having. So make sure that you're taking the opportunity to network, to reach out to help.
No, that's great. And thank you both to Travis and Richard. Thank you for sharing your insights today and taking the time to unpack this for the audience. And a very fruitful and very timely discussion. What I'd like to say, and just as we wrap this up today, is I encourage all of you to go ahead and click on that link that you see there that you can do through the video player there to download the IDC info brief, which takes a deeper dive and really unpacks more further the 5-stage digital maturity model for supply chain execution that Travis and Richard have both been talking about today. And also encourage you the opportunity to book a digital maturity consultation with the Infios team that can help you really understand where are you on that maturity curve and the ways that Infios can help you to advance that maturity, the ways that Richard has been describing here. So again, thank you very much for your time today and wish you the best of the rest of your day. Thank you very much.